It's recording. Good.
Hello everyone, we're at the Lake Research and Management Symposium. Thanks for coming. I'm Scott Cuppett, I'm moderating today, and we're going to start with Kate Henderson, who's going to talk about ecosystem services in 2 New York lakes. So welcome.
Awesome, great, thank you.
I'll give you a 5 minute.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you all for being here this block right after lunch. So my name is Kate Henderson. I'm a PhD candidate at SUNY ESF. And today I'll be talking about some of the research I've been working on alongside my advisor and some of the fantastic undergraduates in our lab, looking at ecosystem services delivery in 2 lakes in different parts of New York State. So a lot of you in this room might have at least some familiarity with this concept of ecosystem services, but just to make sure we're all starting off on the same page, these services are the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. Essentially, these services are a way of conceptualizing all of the benefits we're getting from ecosystems. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment breaks these down into 4 broad categories, which I'll be using in my presentation today. Provisioning services are products we get from ecosystems, such as eating fish out of a lake. Regulating services deal with processes, such as water purification. Cultural ecosystem services are non-tangible benefits. These can be things like recreation, like a sense of place and community, or aesthetics. And then supporting services are kind of processes needed to underpin these other 3 categories. So I've been doing this project in 2 lakes in New York. There's Onondaga Lake in Syracuse is my local lake, and then Cranberry Lake in Adirondacks, where ESF is a field station. The overarching research question for this project is what ecosystem services are summer recreational users identifying from these lakes. I was also interested in looking, having one urban lake and one rural Adirondack lake, how might the services differ between the 2 lakes. Within a site, I was interested in seeing whether anglers and non-anglers are identifying different services, whether at Cranberry, which gets a lot of tourists, whether the locals and the visitors are identifying different sets of ecosystem services at the lake, and then what species people are identifying as important to them and kind of underpinning these services because you have to work fish in. So just a brief orientation to the 2 sites. Onondaga Lake is an urban lake located within Syracuse, New York. It has always been a significant cultural site to the Onondaga Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and historically it was a cold water fishery and a major site for recreation. However, it was very heavily polluted, particularly by mercury, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we're now within the last decade or so seeing a lot of restoration and cleanup. Cranberry is located in the Adirondacks, near Five Ponds Wilderness. It is very rural. It appears to be a much more untouched lake than Onondaga, but it has had numerous species such as bass and pike introduced, which have really changed the food web dynamics. So I was going out to both of these lakes in the summers of 2023 and 24 and talking to both anglers and non-anglers about their use of the lake. I was doing this both by boat and just on foot at boat lunches, docks, walking trails, and parks. Kind of a couple of the questions that I included that I'll be highlighting most in this talk were what species people were fishing for if they were fishing, what species they cared about, kind of how they perceived the lake in the case of Onondaga, or how if their use of the lake might have changed over time with the restoration work, and then overall leading to these questions of what benefits did they get from the lake and how were they defining a healthy lake. In terms of analysis for this interview data, we were using a method called this epistemic network analysis. We can sort of think of this as a cousin to NNDS that is letting us visualize all this information in a 2-dimensional space. It is a network map that lets us show what terms are associated with each other. For example, if someone's talking about a regulating service of water purification, are they also likely to be talking about a provisioning service of eating fish out of the lake? That's 2D visualization, and we can also differentiate between categories. For example, our anglers and our non-anglers, are their answers kind of occupying different positions in this 2D space. This is what the inputs look like that the undergraduate researchers on the project and I would read through every interview and for a long list of ecosystem services score ones and zeros for whether we felt that that service was mentioned in the interview, and then a big spreadsheet with 112 rows of this got inputted into the software. So our overall takeaways at Cranberry, before we dive into that, most anglers didn't express a preference for native or non-native fish, but most of them also thought that the bass were native when they were actually introduced in the 60s. So we really see a major shifted baseline in that system. About 2/3 of the fishing was catch and release. The remaining third were eating fish out of the lake. Bass were the main angling target, headed by long shot, followed by pike, and then a general category of anything. And benefits that people talked about from the lake included a lot of mentions of recreation, things like fishing, swimming, camping. People talked about tourism and its important economic impact on the area. And a lot of people went into a lot of depth and were really telling me stories about how the lake was important to them as a place they spent time with their family, and for some of them, generations of family with connections to that lake. The species people mentioned in these interviews, for anglers on the left, bass were overwhelmingly our top answer for what species they identified as important to them in the lake, followed by all of them, and then trout and brook trout, which I kind of rolled into a category that brook trout were the main one mentioned as trout in that lake. Even though I phrased the question the same way for both groups, that anglers clearly had fish on the mind, whereas our non-anglers on the right really talked about a wide variety of taxa. That loons were the most common answer as an important species. For example, some of those recreational boaters, the hikers, the campers next to the lake, bass, and then fish. But as you can see, we have a variety of birds mentioned, insects, mammals, plants, a lot of those taxa found either on or bordering the lake. In terms of going back to those 4 different categories of ecosystem services, cultural services came up 106 times in these interviews, so that's the most common category, followed by those 24 mentions of provisioning, which are primarily eating fish and drinking water from the lake, and then supporting and regulating. These plots kind of have a lot going on, so to orient you to it, this is our epistemic network analysis results. A larger dot represents that service was mentioned more times, and then the thicker the line between services, the more those are being mentioned together. So when we see these networks of thick lines connecting our terms, those were things that a group was tending to mention a lot in conjunction with each other. So in this case, starting with our locals, people who lived within 200 miles were mostly the people who lived at Cranberry or were the day trippers from the surrounding area. And then in blue on the right, the out-of-town visitors. So for both groups, recreation was the centermost point. That makes sense. These were recreational users. Almost everyone mentioned the cultural ecosystem service of recreation. And we also saw these other cultural services like sense of place and time with family being brought up frequently by both groups, and to a lesser extent, supporting services by both groups. Where it really differed is that local anglers, or local visitors in general, were more likely to talk about provisioning services, particularly consumption. The people who were local to the area were eating more fish out of the lake, or at least talking about it more, whereas the visitors talked more about regulating services, and in particular, water quality was the most frequent regulating service they mentioned. This makes sense that these were the people who had chosen Cranberry Lake as a vacation destination and really traveled to be there, and many of them were saying it was partly because it was this clean and seemingly unspoiled lake that was better water quality than their local lakes. So that was something they cared about. This plot is now it. This software also allows us to statistically compare those two groups and see is there a difference between their responses. In this case, thicker lines mean that there's a bigger difference. A thick blue line is the non-anglers brought them up more. Sorry, I said 12? I heard 15 for them.
I think you have 15 minutes, so I'm giving you...
Oh, perfect. All right, so, and then culturals, and then again, non-anglers with the regulating. Now, despite anglers and non-anglers, as you'd expect, both groups shared recreational services. Anglers had a lot more focus on consuming fish, whereas our non-anglers, the swimmers, recreational boaters, campers, were again talking a lot about clean water and water quality. And again, we do see statistical significance in the responses from these two groups. Now, in Onondaga Lake, this At this site, it was overwhelmingly recreational use. Most of the lake area surrounding the lake is county park. There are walking trails, so a lot of walkers and joggers, bikers, playgrounds, and weekly bass fishing tournaments. And again, the idea of these parks as an important community space was being mentioned. The anglers mostly targeted bass, but a lot of them said they were just out for anything, and all 31 of them only fished catch and release, because as you can see, these signs wrap around all of the piers, warning against fish consumption because of that legacy of mercury contamination. We also saw this difference in perception between long-term and more recent residents. People who were new to Syracuse within the last 10 years thought that the lake was very clean. The long-term residents acknowledged that with the cleanup work, there have been a lot of improvements in the water quality. However, they still express kind of lingering concerns just based on the years where the lake smelled bad, you weren't supposed to touch the water, you weren't supposed to eat fish. And so they said it will just take more time for that trust to be reestablished. For species, anglers, most of them took all of them, bass or nothing specific. Non-anglers, most of them said nothing specific. In this case, these were mostly the joggers, the bikers who wanted a nice park next to a lake to do that recreation in, but didn't really care what species were driving it. And there were lots of mentions in yellow of different kinds of water birds. In this case, almost all of the services they talked about were cultural ecosystem services with far fewer mentions of the other categories. And again, you see that reflected in the plot. Again, anglers on the left, non-anglers on the right. For both groups, it was almost entirely cultural services being talked about. As a reminder, there are those signs up about not eating fish in the lake, so we don't really see those provisioning, or as much of the regulating either. The recreational user, the non-anglers, talked a lot about the park as a community space and the aesthetic value of it as being a beautiful place to spend time, whereas the anglers were a little bit more likely to talk about supporting services in the context of food webs in particular. And again, we see the groups set apart. And we're really now stepping back and comparing the lakes. It becomes clear that Cranberry has this much broader network of ecosystem services being utilized from the lake, whereas Onondaga Lake, because of that history with some contamination, we see we're pretty limited to the cultural services. However, there are strong mentions of these cultural services that for a lot of people this is a really important shared community space, one of the major places they go for exercise, for recreation. And that's something that even 10, 15 years ago, we might not have seen the long-term residents saying, oh yeah, I used to roll my car windows up when I passed the lake because the smell was so bad. So the restoration, and again, a significant difference. So that restoration work at Onondaga Lake has taken that we still see with that history of degradation of the system, the ecosystem service delivery is limited. However, the restoration has really reestablished a lot of those important cultural services, and we have more of those benefits that can kind of be unlocked as conditions continue to improve, potentially bringing back provisioning and regulating. We also really see how different user groups can have different perceptions of the same lake. People occupying the same physical space as a local or an out-of-towner, a fit angler, or someone just swimming or recreating, can have a wide range of values. So when we're creating management plans for a place, we really need to reflect that full user base and the values they're bringing in. And finally, cultural ecosystem services were overwhelmingly most valued at both of these lakes by the people using them. These are services that don't have a monetary value a lot of the time. It's hard to put a number on sense of community or time spent with family, but just because it can be harder to numerically estimate these, it's really important that we don't leave these behind while compared to some of the more obvious market. So with that, I want to thank the Cranberry Lake Biological Station and the More Family Fund for some of this research funding, my lab members for their support throughout this project, and with that, are there any questions?